This video covers Key Area 3.4 of National 5 Biology and follows directly on from Key Area 3.1. This time we're looking at energy in ecosystems. All the energy in an ecosystem can be traced back to the sun. Green plants take in light energy and turn it into chemical energy in the form of glucose. We're going to start off looking at food chains. Food chains are a simple feeding relationship and they're written in a certain format. It always starts on the left-hand side of the page with a green plant and has an arrow pointing to a herbivore and then an arrow pointing to a carnivore. How we interpret that would be green plant is eaten by herbivore, is eaten by carnivore. We've looked at these terms before. Herbivores are animals which only eat plants and carnivores are animals which eat other animals. Most important thing to know at this stage is that the arrows are showing us the direction of energy flow. So when a green plant is eaten by a herbivore, the energy is going from the plant to the herbivore. If you're ever asked in an exam, what do the arrows show in a food chain? Remember to say, arrows show the direction of energy flow. As we go along the food chain, energy is being passed along and it's chemical energy which is passing along. Every single food chain always starts left-hand side of the page with a producer, which is a green plant which can make its own food using energy from sunlight. The green plant is then eaten by the herbivore, which is also termed alternatively primary consumer, and then the herbivore is eaten by the carnivore, also known as secondary consumer. It's easy to remember primary consumer and secondary consumer in order because you're familiar with those terms from schools, primary school before secondary school. Here is a food chain, and underneath the positions that the different organisms are occupying are written in. A green plant is eaten by a rabbit, is eaten by a fox. Green plant is occupying the role of producer, making its own food. Rabbit is occupying the role of primary consumer, or else herbivore. These can be used to describe this position in a food chain. And the fox is following on from that is fulfilling the role of secondary consumer or else carnivore. Life is never as simple as each species just has one food to eat, so we often show the complicated interaction between different food chains in an ecosystem in a diagram called a food web. The main questions you get asked about food webs is what would be the effect on the other organisms in the food web if a particular species died out. Now that could be, the numbers could be going down because of pollution or they could be going down because of a disease. Let's have a wee look at this food web before we go on to any questions about it. One of the problems some pupils have is not having a wide range of knowledge of different types of animals and plants, and that is really not going to be an issue here as long as you are aware of what the arrows are showing. So for example, lots of people haven't heard of primrose, but they could figure out that primrose is a producer because there's no arrow pointing into it. It's not being it doesn't eat anything. Okay, so primrose must be a producer making its own food. And then we can see that primrose is eaten by snails and voles and rabbits. Oak is also eaten by rabbits. Let's look at an example. If oaks were all killed out by a disease, would all the rabbits die out? Answer no, because they can still eat primroses. So that's the sort of questions you'll get. What would happen if these ones were removed? What would happen to this other species? I really like this tip that somebody's added into this summary. There's often more than one answer that's correct, but just go for the most obvious and direct answer. There's a separate little video that goes with this where I've taken 3 food webs and looked at some questions based on them, so you might want to watch that video after this one. Now we're looking at energy going through our food chain, and we've got a big food chain here. The most important thing to know in this bit is that energy being passed from one stage to the next happens, but most of the energy is actually lost from the food chain. So all the energy from the oak leaves, only a small fraction of it actually gets to the caterpillars, and only a small fraction of the energy from the caterpillars gets to the shrews, and so on. And we'll have a look at some specific examples to illustrate ways that this energy is being lost from the food chain. Before I look at those examples, I want to make a point of stressing that in an exam, you will be saying only energy that was used for growth is passed on to the next stage in a food chain. So we'll give some illustrations of that. Ways energy can be lost: movement, heat, production, and waste. If we look at the first two ways energy is lost, movement and heat production, think about a little mouse that's eaten by an owl. All the energy that mouse used in its life over the last few weeks, running about, hiding from predators and getting food, all that movement energy hasn't been passed on to the owl, nor has any of the energy that the mouse used to heat its body over those few weeks. That's all lost as far as the food chain is concerned. The only energy that the mouse is going to provide to the owl is energy that was used to grow the mouse's body. So if the owl eats a big mouse, it's going to get a lot of energy. If the owl eats a small mouse, it's getting less energy. If we think about waste, if you take an example of a bird eating a snail, only energy that was put into building the soft-bodied part of the snail is getting passed on to the bird that eats it. The shell is just waste. So uneaten body parts might be a more specific example than waste. Our last subsection refers to two different kinds of pyramids, which are diagrams which are used to illustrate features of food chains. The first thing that you want to learn is a definition for pyramid of energy. Pyramid of energy shows the energy of the organisms at each stage in a food chain or web. Notice that the name pyramid of energy then kind of repeats in the definition. If it's a pyramid of energy, it's showing the energy at each stage in a food chain. So it's quite easy if you've got to match something up, because the answer's in the definition itself. Pyramids of energy are shown in kilojoules of dry mass per square metre per year, but you don't have to know the units. But if the question talks about those units, then obviously you'll use them then, but you don't need to memorise them. If we're looking at a pyramid, if you remember, your food chain goes from left to right across the page. When we turn that into a pyramid, we start with our producer on the bottom, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and if there is one, this is tertiary consumer. That's not a term you need to know for this course, but some people don't like having an unexplained top part to the pyramid. It's the same idea as we talked about before with schools, primary school, secondary school. Tertiary education is universities and things like that you might do after school. But that's an aside. Let's go back to a food chain. Imagine a food chain. We take our producer, put it here, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. If you look at the shape of the pyramid, you'll notice that the base of it, the producer, has the most energy. And then as we go up our pyramid, we're getting less and less energy at each stage. And that has been previously explained of ways that energy is lost. So movement, heat, and uneaten body parts are all ways that energy can be lost through a food chain. Sometimes rather than being shown as these bars, you'll see the pyramid drawn as a kind of triangle shape with the little sections marked across it. It's the same idea. Pyramid of energy always takes this shape, a wide base, getting smaller as you get to the top, because the producer always has the most energy, with energy being lost at each stage as we go up. The other type of pyramid that we use is pyramid of numbers. And pyramid of numbers, you need to learn a definition for that. So pyramid of numbers is a diagram showing the number of organisms at each food stage in a food chain or web. So I'll say that again. Pyramid of numbers shows the number of organisms at each stage in a food chain or web. Again, notice the name and the definition, they've got number in them. So it's quite easy to figure it out if you've given a multiple choice or something. Pyramid of numbers shows you the number of organisms at each stage. Now, most pyramids of numbers take on a normal pyramid shape and are identical in shape to the pyramid of energy for the same food chain. Here is an example one. Grass, caterpillar, sparrow, hawk. So if that was in a food chain, you would have grass on the left, arrow, caterpillar, arrow, sparrow, arrow, hawk. And when we put them into the pyramid, producer on the bottom, you can see that the pyramid starts wide at the bottom and gets smaller as we go up. That's the normal shape for pyramid of numbers. However, there are certain exceptions, and the first and main exception is when we have a very, very large single producer. For example, an oak tree. One oak tree could support many caterpillars. So if you have that type of pyramid, your pyramid of numbers looks different from the pyramid of energy for the same information. And that is all down to this being a single individual. If it's shown as the more triangle-shaped pyramid, what you end up with is something that looks a bit like a simplistic Christmas tree drawing. You've got a tiny little stalk here for which would be the trunk if it was a tree, which would be the single oak tree, and then a wide base for the caterpillars, and going up into a point with fewer and fewer as you go up. So if you've got one large single producer at the bottom, you get a different shape of pyramid like this. The other example you get in the exams is rosebush with greenfly on it, and that would give you the same shape as this. A more recently introduced example of an odd-looking pyramid of numbers is when you've got a parasite involved. So the bottom of the food chain this time looks normal. If you have a look at this here, one fox would have many fleas on it. So that gives us this kind of unusual pyramid of numbers. So pyramid of energy always looks the same shape. Pyramid of numbers can have different shapes from the pyramid of energy from the same food chain. You need to know reasons why that might be, and that's what's illustrated in these two here.